Welcome to Burning Platforms, our fortnightly look at the intersection between tech and politics, brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. I'm Peter Lewis. This edition, we dive deep into new research on how worker power could be the key to harnessing AI to deliver real productivity, with Professor Nicholas Davis from UTS's Human Technology Institute. But first, our rundown of the latest news from around the world with our regular panel, Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea and HealthEngine CEO Dan Stinton.
Well, here we are at our after hours time of recording it late on a Tuesday night in our virtual studio. The good news is that ChatGPT, which was down for a couple of hours, looks like it's up, so we can all talk like robots again if we need to quickly get an answer to any of the burning questions of this week with our regular panel. Lizzie O'Shea, just back from the movies in Melbourne. Hey, Lizzie.
Hi, nice to see you.
And Dan Stinton, experiencing the travails of the housing crisis in Perth at the moment in his in-laws' bedroom. Hello, Dan.
G'day, Peter. Thanks for the introduction.
It feels like a privacy violation at the get-go, but anyway.
The whole lot. We can always wind that one back. And joining us from Canberra, my good friend and collaborator at the moment on some really interesting research we're going to be talking about in the deep dive, Professor Nicholas Davis, or Nick, as I like to call you, from UTS's Human Technology Institute. Thanks for joining us, Nick.
G'day, Pete. Can I just say there's no greater red flag for a podcast focusing on AI than the host saying ChatGPT in the intro?
I'm kind of loose with acronyms. I've never been good at them since I went through the union movement with the CMFEU. And I am going to the biannual conference of the ACUNT tomorrow in Adelaide as well. So a bit dyslexic with the acronyms, but you are right. But also the other one's back up too, Nick. So thanks for sharing that one. Where are we going to kick off? Lizzie, you've done most of the prep this week, so you can lead off.
All right,
you are going to be talking about the new deal between OpenAI and Apple, which is not the first and only one, but why is this one different, or why is it similar to all the others?
I know we've developed a fondness for talking about Sam Altman, but he does just seem to have a very busy schedule of stepping on rakes, but he's taken time out from that to do some pretty significant deals with a number of large tech companies. And he is an interesting character in part because he seems to be advancing so many of the causes of OpenAI while having a lot of troubles, it seems, internally in the company with governance and the like. And so I think it's an interesting time to watch what he's doing. Basically, there's been reports for a while about him doing various deals with different organizations, which look like places where OpenAI might be able to source data for training on its models. So there was a recent report last week of them doing a deal with News Corp. I think Sam Altman complimented News Corp on its excellent reporting as a basis for doing this deal. But essentially it will mean that some of the commentary from News Corp, it's not clear whether it's opinion as well as factual reporting, will appear in the responses from ChatGPT. But obviously we assume that the impact is also that ChatGPT or OpenAI will be able to train models like ChatGPT on content without having to without having to violate copyright, which is what it's done in other instances. So, the News Corp deal happened while at the same time the New York Times is suing OpenAI for copyright infringement. So it looks to me like they're trying to avoid further lawsuits. But then more recently this week, there was a deal announced with Apple, and it looks like that is a bit contentious within Apple as well. But essentially, it looks like what it may be used for is a sophisticated chatbot. It's not entirely clear how Apple plan to use it, but integrate it into their software in some format or another. And this has been criticised internally. Apple's head of machine learning has indicated that he thought the last thing that people needed was another AI chatbot in the Apple ecosystem. But, they've still done this deal. So he obviously didn't.
Are we back talking about her yet again? Like, is this a personal organizer
possibly.
play?
You can understand why it might be an upgraded version of Siri. And, I was listening in the week to some commentary about this, and at the time Siri came out, it was seen as this amazing phenomenon of technology. And it's possible this could be the next iteration of it, being asked questions outside of what you usually ask Siri to do. There's a question around whether you'd tell users about when they're leaving, an Apple product and using another one, or the origins of kind of responses that might be given. What I think is also interesting is that it looks like...
Hey, Lizzie, don't turn your phone off. Is that sort of thing? Like it's actually...
I mean, yeah, maybe. I don't know. I think it remains a little bit unclear, but there's obviously Altman's vision is to pursue partnerships with these large tech companies, but there's a lot of people to be pleased. Like apparently there's also a deal in the works with Google, or that's what's being reported, but a lot of these companies are competitors as well. And Microsoft, of course, has provided a huge amount of funding to OpenAI, and they in fact might be getting shirty about some of these deals that Altman is doing with these major tech companies, which do often, are in competition with each other. So I don't know whether he's just trying to do deals, as I described it, as with everyone, everywhere, all at once. But it's clear that these models are extremely data hungry. So the data is going to have to come from somewhere. To date, at least, for the most part, Altman has been taking that without asking, which has been the traditional model of Silicon Valley companies, I think it's fair to say. But now this looks like a way in which he can protect that business model and take it to the next level by securing, not just access to this data, but also stakeholders in the future of OpenAI's success. So, I think he's a very good salesman. I'm not sure if who's going to win out of this, like whether some of the criticism coming out of Apple is valid. I mean, Apple's been a very profitable company for a long time, and they're not like Google. They haven't launched heaps of products that have failed, although there was, of course, the Apple car. But they have had a lot of success, and I do wonder whether their nous for what products might be successful in a consumer market might be slightly better than Sam Altman's. But it is an interesting time in which he's trying to secure that business model, and I don't know whether he'll be able to please all stakeholders at the same time. It's getting increasingly difficult as you bring more of them into the tent, I suppose, is what my observation would be.
Dan, did we talk about the media deals with News Corp last week or not? Or has it happened since then? Everything's rolling in, but my question is, if he's doing deals with News Corp, is that going to make the AI veer right, or how do you then balance it out? Or are you, in your previous life, would you be getting on the blower from the Guardian saying, do a deal with us to balance things?
Well, I think we were talking with them about potentially doing a deal. And I'm sure that we're going to see OpenAI do scores of these deals, if not hundreds of them, over the next few months and years. It does. I want to talk about Apple too, but just while we're on the News Corp one, it does feel a little bit like Netflix in a way, and the studios who all did a deal with Netflix as they were starting, before they realized that once again they were just the lowly content makers in the digital platforms empire. And I can understand News Corp's motivation for doing this, and another publication's motivation for doing this, because it's better than having your content simply stolen, which is what a lot of these companies have done previously. But I think we're going to end up in a circumstance probably where it's going to become once again a competition issue, similar to what we've seen with Google, where they'll go and do hundreds of these deals, and then all the market power sits with the platform, with OpenAI, because no one publisher is worth that much, but in aggregate they're worth heaps. And instead of all the news publishers getting together and doing what would be, in fact, anti-competitive and collectively refusing to do a deal with OpenAI, which I think would make a huge difference, they're being picked off one by one. And I just think we've seen this movie before. It's not going to end well. It's not going to end well for publishers. As usual, publishers are going to end up with the raw end of the stick. And more, as we talked about last week, more and more users will simply just be going to OpenAI or to Google Gemini and for the answers, and not going to the news sources. So I think it's a really troubling development, albeit one which is probably unavoidable. Can I make a quick comment about Apple too while we're here, Peter? Can you indulge me?
Always.
How could Sam Altman not do this deal? Like, this is a prize which is much bigger than Microsoft, or at least on par with it, because they have the largest and most valuable audience base outside of Google Android, which is obviously off limits because Google are doing their own thing. Apple are absolutely in the box seat in terms of having hundreds of millions of iOS users, the wealthiest people in the world as well. This is a deal that Sam Altman just simply had to do. And what's really interesting about this, again, when it comes to sort of competition, Apple and Google have been in this sort of very beneficial alliance, anti-competitive alliance over some time, where Apple has effectively not gone into search because they haven't needed to, because they've just had a revenue share deal with Google, and Google has effectively given them a third of their profits every single year for years now. It just feels like that strategy playing out again. Like, it feels like this is becoming an industry in its own right. It requires huge amount of compute power, huge amount of investment. It feels like Apple at this stage at least have gone, well, why don't we just do what we've done with Google and not compete with these guys and simply skim the revenue off the top if and when it gets to that point. So I think from OpenAI's point of view, it makes perfect sense. From Apple's point of view, it makes perfect sense. It's probably going to end up being massively anti-competitive in the way that the exclusive deal for Google to be the default search engine on Safari is as well. But time will tell.
Nick, how are you looking at it? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, just to jump in on that anti-competitive piece, I'm looking at it from the problem of the data play. So I agree that locking up the channel with Apple through OpenAI is a smart business move for Sam Altman. But what we're actually seeing here is just another example of exclusive data deals with companies that are going to then sit on and hoard essentially for training that data. I have talked to a couple of incredibly large tech companies who've lost out on these deals recently and therefore are struggling to do the training that they need for their own models because bigger fish have come along and eaten up exclusivity. So taking News Corp data off the market, taking Vox, taking Atlantic, taking the Financial Times, OpenAI is creating a good barricade, moat, anti-competitive moat around what would be otherwise potentially kind of leverageable and infinitely, as the media market knows, infinitely replicable resources in that high quality journalistic data and putting it just exclusively to their own use. So they're locking up a channel as a engagement to the customer, but they're also locking up a massive input in the data. And that's very smart at this stage when they're flush with cash.
Can you help me understand what they're doing by metaphor? Because I don't actually think I understand it. Like, are they building big reserves of a resource like colonizing the Middle East, or what are they?
Yeah, so if you think about this idea that the raw input for large language models is high quality patterns of well-written English, basically. That's the highest value source at the moment because the half the web users are in English. So the idea here is if you lock up the back catalogues of News Corp and Financial Times and The Atlantic, and you get some of the bigger prizes eventually, New York Times and others, you've just got this massive store of data for training future versions of large language models, but not just future versions. You've got the ongoing generation as well as the interaction on those sites, which is curated. So you're paying to exclusively have access for your training on the input side for these data sources. And it's not certain that all of these are completely exclusive. So I don't know for sure that News Corp has said this is a 100% exclusive deal, but I do know that for image library training, they have been exclusive so far, and the owners of the content are going to the highest bidder. As Dan pointed out, though, they're probably selling it way too cheap at this stage. They're probably selling it at a massive discount to what it's worth in the future because they want access to OpenAI powering a chatbot on their website, or because they get a halo effect for Sam Altman.
Or they just want to plug the gap that Meta's going to leave in.
Yeah, exactly. So I think while Apple's pursuing a version of a strategy that it's done before, where it says we don't want to have to build our own search engine, let's just do the deal with Google. They've said for chatbots and large language models at that very conversational end, we don't need to play in that market when someone else is doing it. This is going up against one of the best chatbots in the world at that end is silly. They'll still use large language models themselves on device and in the cloud for other purposes. But to have that kind of conversational interface, to take us back to Scarlett Johansson, Pete, that's what they're outsourcing here. And in the meantime, what of course, as Dan put it, what OpenAI gets is that massive access. And what Lizzie was saying is completely true. This is terrible for competition and for the market.
You wonder whether this would survive scrutiny, though, by a more forward-thinking regulator. Like, I think in 5 years' time, there may be more scrutiny of these kinds of deals, for example, because it does create a competitive advantage and allows like a large company to come in and buy stuff at a cheap price. I do think Apple's business model is slightly different, though, as a consumer products business, and it has prioritized privacy as being one of its offerings. Like you're in the ecosystem, your data remains within it. I think that claim can be contested, or there's more nuance to it than that. But I do wonder in those circumstances whether this will be something that they end up using in their consumer products. There have been many consumer products that were overpromised and have proven to be underdelivered. Like Oculus. It's not as though everyone's using an Oculus. There's others as well, Google Glass and stuff. So these are big things at the time, and then it turns out they don't end up being integrated into commercial product or consumer products, maybe in other industrial settings and the like. But I do wonder whether Apple's going to get much out of this, and maybe I'm sure they've got a sophisticated negotiator at their end, but it's a slightly different business model to other kinds of large tech companies. But he's obviously, it's true that Altman, I imagine, was very motivated to get it. So it's an interesting space to watch.
Let's move on to Google. So a month ago, I think it was Privacy Day, and I think Dan and I, you and I both put in our requests to find out what records. I still haven't heard back from Google myself as part of their transparency. So, good. Maybe
I found my address and phone number on a couple of places, and I asked for them to be removed from search, and they said yes to one and no to another. But and I've asked for a review, but that review is still pending.
Mine must have gone into spam or something. Anyway, we've got more to worry about than that. What's the latest revelation from Spark Toro?
Yeah, so this risks being an inside baseball story, but it's betting platforms, so it's probably going to fit right in. But there was a big story in the SEO community last week, so I think most people know what that is. But just in case, search engine
is there an SEO community? What do they do? Predict what people are going to like. I bet you're going to.
I did say I was inside baseball. Let me start again. There's an SEO industry. I think that's fair to say. So search engine optimization. There is a whole bunch of digital agencies that exist, literally thousands, if not millions, of these around the world, and their whole point of existing is to help websites and website owners effectively get traffic from Google. And it's called search engine optimization, but it's really Google optimization. That's what it is, because there's really only one. I think the latest. Well, I mean, there's a few, but I think their market share, I think, is 91%. I think I read last week. So 91% of people start their browsing with Google. So that's pretty big number. I think Ricky might have spoken about that on our last show. Anyway. Yeah. So what happened last week was an anonymous source shared thousands of leaked Google Search API documents with a guy called Rand Fishkin, who's a blogger and former SEO expert himself, or still an SEO expert, but doesn't work in that space anymore, mostly just a blogger now. And what that did is it gave us, and by the way, as a bit of background, the mainstream media picked up on this, started asking questions of Google. Google said nothing for a few days and eventually came out and confirmed that the leak was accurate, and it was actually a really big insight into how Google's search algorithm works. Now, this is the first time, I think, in history that we have actually seen anything of any detail into how Google's search algorithm works. Prior to this, it's always been very high-level statements from Google and guidance around how things work. This is the first time I've actually had some idea of what goes into driving the Google search algorithm and how you can appear on page one. And look, it's really early days. I mean, this only came out a week ago. I think there's literally thousands of signals that are being examined here. So I think we're going to learn more about this over the coming weeks and months as people sort of dive into the detail. But a couple of things have come clear already. The first one is that one of the main signals, if you like, to determine how you rank in Google search is something called dwell time. And that basically means when you click through on a search engine on Google, you click through to a website, how much time you spend on that website determines the quality of that website, and therefore determines how high you rank, which makes sense. The only thing is that Google has for years claimed that they don't use that as one of their signals for determining the Google search rankings. And I think the reason they say that is because the only way that you can get access to that information is if you actually have control of a browser. And Chrome just happens to be the largest web browser in the world. And as it turns out, is in fact one of the main motivations for Google launching the Chrome browser was so that they could improve the quality of their search results. So I think this is fascinating for a number of reasons. There's so many different angles that you could go in with this, but I would just make the point, which I guess I kind of always bang on about, and that is that we always suspected, if you like, that Google launched Chrome in order to be able to sort of lock up search and control its position in search. And now we kind of know that, well, not kind of, now we know that for certain that was their main motivation for doing it. And I think this becomes an antitrust issue because, again, there's all these calls to break up Google, which don't seem to go anywhere and probably never will. But we now have pretty strong evidence that the number one search browser in the world, or number one web browser in the world, Google Chrome, and the number one search engine, Google, are actually feeding off each other. And if that was not the case, there will be more opportunities for people to be able to compete in both of those markets. And I just think that's a really interesting development, apart from a bunch of other things we could look at. But what do others think?
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. I think this also comes back off on the back of revelations about the use of incognito mode, in fact, being less incognito than users would expect. So it did record certain kinds of information that obviously went back to Google, and Google complained that those criticisms were invalid. But, it was, they still got pinged for it. And yeah, so, there's multiple ways in which I think Google operates in this way. It acquires not just competitors, but also products from other companies to then shore up that space that may not look necessarily anti-competitive because it's an aligned business. And then it turns out, they've either used predatory pricing tactics, pricing at zero or similar, or, benefits of being in an ecosystem, and then also using the competitive advantage of having multiple different offerings. And this is something that competition regulators, it's fair to say, have been slow to catch on to. I think we're now in a better position than we have been in previous decades, really, in terms of grappling with this business model. I don't know if that will mean we see these kinds of services broken up, but there are clear ways, I think, that you could do that logically. Like, why couldn't you hive off a search engine from, an email client provider, from a search product? A web browser, I should say, from a search product. But in the same way that you could with, like Meta, obviously the contentious acquisition there was WhatsApp, but these businesses still remain largely separate in some ways. So there's a possibility, I think, of reversing it. And this is the kind of revelation that does add weight to the imprimatur of regulators to pursue those options. Question is, how long do we have to wait for that to occur? I don't think, because of failure also, I think, to do it indicates to the market that this kind of conduct is tolerated because you do it in the early stages. That's why we do have this iteration of OpenAI going around acquiring data sets, making deals, protecting itself from competition, because it sees that the regulators have treated previous companies who've done the same thing with a form of tolerance. So, there's an argument that it's just not good enough to let these things lie. Maybe breaking them up is now more of an imperative than it has been for a number of years, and as more evidence is revealed about it. That's what I think is kind of necessary. There's multiple ways in which I think that can have a positive impact on these markets.
Yeah, Nick, I was joking before we started recording that burning platforms has kind of become burning AI, but they all sit on top of each other a little bit. And particularly if Google's on a house of cards because of revelations like this and the antitrust, but it is one of the bases with the other big tech platforms of being the home of these large language learning models. Where does that end up? And does that create a structural flaws in the systems that are being built for artificial intelligence?
Well, for a start, it just suggests that a big issue here is this kind of, in a way, failure by competition regulators around the world to come up to speed since the late 90s with the big Microsoft actions by the Department of Justice, and actually move on new markets like search and advertising, which have been dominated by platforms. So in the Washington, D.C. District Court, we had arguments of the US versus Google on the antitrust, the first of two big antitrust cases at the beginning of this month, actually. If I were a prosecutor on the US side, I'd probably be frantically asking Judge Amit Maida if I could add a couple of more things from the leak to the evidence there around the points that Dan made, around evidence that this is further kind of adding fuel to the fire of anti-competitive behaviour in the market. But that really, the big revelation at the end of that was the $20 billion payment that Apple made to Google in 2022 for that access to the channel, for the search channel. And that kind of, it smacks very much of the $13 billion that Apple's just agreed to pay OpenAI for a similar kind of channel access deal. So depending on how that court rules in an impending decision, really on that kind of first of two competition lawsuits in the US on Google, we'll see a signal on how much at least the US really thinks that there's an opportunity to upgrade and to hold to account on basic competition issues, the platforms and their behavior, and then by extension, of course, can play that into the AI side. I think there is a question here also about the data gathering aspect. So not just by the search engine not just locking up the search and the advertising and the ability to predict, but obviously just the raw capture is something that's valuable to organizations as well. I'm assuming that Apple and OpenAI are doing deals to feed that data back as well, which goes to Lizzie's point about Apple has had this reputation as being all about privacy. Their ads, if you drive down a street in a major Australian city at the moment, you often see when the iPhone comes out, iPhone built for privacy as kind of the USP. That's put into threat when you start to move more and more services off your device and off your ecosystem. But that may be ultimately a smart business decision if it's if it builds the ability to use that data for training and keep people engaged or manipulate them in different ways.
Dan, just to round that off, so back to your SEO community, how will they view this? It's like, if you've mastered something, do you really want to do this segregation? Like, if the SEO community is the Google gaming community, do they want to see these reforms, or are they happy with things as they stand?
Well, people are outraged. I mean, I did a bit of reading on this over the last couple of days, and people in the SEO community, Peter, are outraged by the fact that Google has effectively been. I mean, some people are claiming at least that Google has outright lied to them. At the very least, I think it's been quite misleading with some of the things that they've said around how Google search works. I mean, it's not too big a statement to say that the internet is built around Google's algorithm. I mean, it really is. Like, every website kind of formats their website structure to make it optimized for Google so that Google can deliver them traffic. And I think the last point I'll make on this, and then we can move on, is I've been saying for ages, I said this in the news media bargaining code debate, I think it's probably the one thing that Lizzie and I agreed on during that debate, which was it's too important an algorithm for it to be locked up and in secret in the halls of Mountain View. Like, this absolutely controls the digital economy. And we've got an insight into how it works. Because of that insight and it being different to what Google has said previously, people are going to change how they operate quite substantially. The SEO industry, at least, is going to change how they operate. And I think if ever we needed more reasons to make Google be more transparent with their algorithm, I think this is a pretty good example of why we need that, at least. So
it's high risk.
Let's see if it makes
a high risk algorithm, arguably.
Yeah. Look, I was going to bring, and I'm conscious that we've sort of dragged out those first two issues because they were so complex, just some of the action going on in Canberra at the moment. We've had the government saying they're going to pass legislation to criminalise the posting of deep fake porn. We've now got some of the crossbenchers calling for action to outlaw deep fake material around elections. There's also the calls for banning kids on social media. There's also calls, I think, to ban or age verification on pornography and on gambling. And rather than go into each of those specifically because they're own at piece, it probably sets up the second part of our discussion a little bit. But I'm interested in all of your views on this idea of individual bits of legislation to solve specific problems that are emerging, are they valid things to do? I'll start with you, Lizzie. Like, is something like banning or criminalising the posting of manipulated pornography without people's consent the role of legislatures, or how should we be thinking about dealing with the consequences of this very fast-moving environment?
I mean, I can understand the motivation to ban it. I just think, how do you enforce it? This is a serious question. And the same is true, I think, for something like age verification for accessing social media, which sounds sensible, but then the enforcement aspects are very complicated, or certainly involve huge compromises for lots of people and technology that may not exist yet. And so, I think there's a tendency in tech policy making to look to tech solutions to the policy problems that are prevented, whereas in fact there's no single solution to some of this stuff. Perhaps with the exception, I'd say, of privacy reform, because I do think that at the source where data is collected and then used to feed complex algorithms, used to, create audiences for targeted advertising. Like, I think that is probably one of the key through lines in all of these discussions, limiting people's capacity to use personal information, including imagery, for certain kinds of purposes or in ways that aren't fair and reasonable. But, otherwise, I think that my experience of engaging in these kinds of discussions is the assumption that there's a single tech solution to some of these problems is an easy political point to make, but is much harder to deliver on. And I don't think it promotes good policy making. So, yeah, that's the phenomenon I see in Canberra. This is nothing new. I think part of it comes from the fact that large technology companies have not thought very deeply about their social license to operate, and in fact have violated it on repeated occasions, which opens them up to criticism. And that validity is what fuels these kinds of political point scoring debates. So, that's partly why I think it's very important to hold tech companies to account, but not least because if they behaved better, it would improve policymaking in this space generally. So, it's a source of frustration and disappointment. And, my answers aren't particularly good. I think we need more research into some of these topics as to how the technology moves, as to how particularly it affects young people, about the connections with broader social problems and the like. We need to be more nuanced in our interventions and think about who are the different stakeholders and how we can work with them to put people who are harmed at the centre of these kinds of policy-making initiatives. But these things are difficult, they're expensive, they take time, and they don't usually work well with short-term governments who hold office for 3 years at a time. It's just a perennial problem of politics, I suppose. But that doesn't mean it's not worth trying. But this is, I think, what we need. The role of kind of civil society and academia is included in that, is to kind of debunk some of those phenomena and make sure that there's a well-informed public that can also hold MPs to account.
That said, Dan, tough on tech is good for clicks, good for polls. 68% in our Guardian today supporting the increase in the age limit, and you get high 60s for anything that looks like something must be done. And it works because it simplifies the story, right?
Yeah, but I think it has to be in a way. I totally shared Lizzie's view, by the way, that it's better if there can be a structural approach to this. And privacy is one of those areas, I think, to your point, Lizzie, where if you actually get the data gathering or influence the data gathering at the source, and you can prevent a lot of harms downstream. But particularly with AI, I think this is going to have an impact across so many different industries in so many different ways. And this is just one of them, where I think you have to kind of approach it in a piece by piece sort of way, where in the absence of something more structural. The analogy that I've been influenced by, I think Benedict Evans, an analyst, has prosecuted this case before, is if you look at the auto industry, there's a whole bunch of laws that regulate that. And some are to wear seatbelts, some are to have speed limits on highways, some are to have environmental standards for emissions. And they're all solving different problems, but it's such a big industry that there's so many problems to solve that you have to solve it with lots and lots of different pieces of legislation. And I just think that AI is going to have such a profound impact across so many different industries in so many different ways that we're going to have to approach it in this way. And this is just one more example of that. I'd also just make the point, which I think we've said before, but they should just outlaw deepfakes broadly, not just in the context of porn. I think if we go in that direction, it's going to make things a lot simpler for people to understand. I think that's where we're going to end up. But that's just one of these problems that we need to solve.
This is all by way of a bit of a segue into Nick's work. So feel free to make a point about the elections, Nick, but I'm also interested because I don't think people quite understand the focus of Human Technology Institute is really that structural piece. So why don't you take us through a little bit about the mission of this entity that you and Ed have set up, and then weigh in on elections if you like as well. You can weave the two in, I'm sure.
Yeah, sure. So look, the work that Ed Santo and Sally Cripps and I do at the Human Technology Institute, which is part of UTS in Sydney, although I'm based in Canberra, as you said, Pete, is really about shifting, creating kind of some new conditions for the market around safe and responsible AI use. And when we think about that, we start by thinking about the norms that are created, and that often looks a lot like public policy and legislation, and filtering down into different regulatory actions, supporting enforcement, supporting rights of action, supporting law reform, in particular around the Privacy Act is one of our key areas of focus in that space, filling those really holes where either harms that are systemic or diffuse regulatory or direct consumer harms can be plugged. And then where I spend most of my time is helping organisations to start to think about those evolving incentives as well as the ways that they treat stakeholders, engage with the market, and think through what kind of new processes, approaches, systems they need to work well with all these amazing AI capabilities, but to do so on the right side of the law, but also in the best interests of their customers, their employees, their investors, etc. And then where Sally works is at the model level, like the AI system in particular, using some really advanced mathematics to think about how causality comes into machine learning to help us actually back out some of the things that we've been missing along the way with all these prediction-based models, which is why things occur. And if you're a policymaker today, or you're anyone in a non-profit or looking to get a positive outcome that relies on some kind of understanding why something creates an output, AI doesn't help you much, surprisingly today. So we're trying to fill the gap and support the kind of filling in those norms at the top end, overarching aspects, helping organisations, but then also doing some frontier development of AI models as well. And I guess two things in reflecting on the conversation we've just had. The first one is when we talk to experts in this space about where the problems lie, legal experts, and Lizzie, you were there at our most recent discussion on this, tend to say that about 70% of all the issues that occur or that they can conceive of in the moment of the next few years occurring in Australia around AI, 70% of them, there is current legislation that more or less covers it. But that leaves a pretty big gaping 30% of where we actually do need some specific approaches. I think when it comes to this stuff, shoring up and doing the reform in the Privacy Act is probably a good half whack of that. But when we talk about political deepfakes, the Electoral Act, obviously hasn't been tested in this regard. But Section 329 and a bunch of others, they're not specific to electoral choices. They're specific to how you cast your ballot. So that they're not actually talking to this critical question of someone putting out a misleading advertisement or representation that could influence a voter's choice. And if you were clever and read the Electoral Act quite carefully, you could design your deepfakes to avoid kind of being in contradiction to those particular parts of the Act, and that's a real problem. So we probably do need some aspect there. In terms of who to hold accountable for this, everyone immediately, like voting platforms implies, will probably say, well, tech platforms. But actually, probably the most important aspect is that you say whoever issues these kind of ads, particularly if it's on the ballot for campaign, you're going to hold them responsible. Second, that you allow and you make it clear that the remedy is injunction, not damages, because you have to be able to act quickly to take down things during an electoral cycle. You can't compensate people for a lost election properly. And third, you've got to give the right people the right of action to come up. And those three issues of where does liability naturally respond? What are the kind of remedies, and who has the right to bring an action? That describes so much law reform that we need to get right in this area, and that certainly Lizzie knows far more about than I do. When it comes to the work that we've just published, it's actually about listening to those people in organisations that are closest to those harms, the closest to the impact on them. Because when we talk to regulators about what's going wrong at the policy end of the spectrum, one of the key things that they tell people like me is, look, we get our signals of when to prosecute, of when to bring an action, of whether to prioritise resources to a particular area. We get that on the basis of members of the public issuing complaints and raising this with us. And if those signals aren't coming through because people don't know that AI is being used to harm them, they don't know their rights are being limited, that is a massive problem for all of us. Because unless we both get that clarity of the signal and allow advocates like Digital Rights Watch and others that Lizzie represents, that unless we get the advocate space really supported and funded and resourced in this way, we won't have that pull through to the effective enforcement action and other aspects. So with you, Pete, we spent time talking to workers.
So let's stop before we go into the work. Like that point of almost embedding friction into the system to make it harder for technology just to roll over is actually the best outcome for everyone. And that was kind of the insight from the book that you sent me the link to it at the end of last year, which I got very excited about, Power and Progress by Darren Asaglu, and I can never say any
Simon
names
Johnson.
or acronyms, and Simon Johnson. But it makes the point that you only get economic productivity out of technological change if it's driven from the bottom up as a tool, as a connection, as a market. And we had the opportunity working together to put that to the test, that thesis with nurses, retail workers and public sector workers. And it basically reinforced that theory. And I don't think it wasn't a confirmation bias. It just sort of rolled out in front of us. Yeah.
We really didn't expect it. So part of the broader context here is, particularly when you look at generative AI, the research that's been done in industry with industry on generative AI has all been consultants and professionals and folk and tech company employees. And it's not been on, the vast majority of Australian workers who are going to be facing changes in their day-to-day because of these systems coming up. So that's we deliberately focused on what is a cohort of about 4.5 million workers across Australia. So nurses, retail workers, and Australian public servants, APS. We actually focused on the federal APS workers, but still representative of a much broader cohort of state and local council employees as well. And we ran, thanks to your team, Pete, what is I think is a really innovative and thoughtful 2-week kind of inquiry, very reflective, asking people their opinions at the beginning, realizing that the average worker doesn't have much background in AI, which is totally fine, giving them some use cases, asking them to talk to their colleagues, keep a diary, and then talk to us at various points of time and have, with your colleague Alyssa leading, Pete, just incredible conversations that frankly rivaled any set of AI experts you could sit and listen to on a panel. Like you sit down, give your average retail worker, or your interested retail worker that wants to be on one of these panels, give them 2 weeks of priming, at a few minutes a day, and then get them to talk to you from their living room, and it's incredibly insightful. And the big insights around this were the kind of depth of appreciation and understanding of where tasks could be shifted to benefit them, customers, patients, the public. But also this something that, as you said, Pete, really picks up on the economic literature and the modelling that's been done in this space, which is there are 2 big dangers whenever any type of automation comes in, and they're particularly dangerous with AI because of the features that we have. The first one is you can just rush in and get what Acemoglu and Johnson called so-so automation. So-so automation is their word for it doesn't give you much productivity upside, doesn't actually work that well, but it still displaces workers. It puts them under more surveillance, makes their lives harder, puts them under more stress. But you actually just get more frustrated customers and not much upside. You basically shift some of your your labor into capital costs, but in the end of the day, it's probably not worth it because you have other offsetting effects. And the second problem is that you have actually uses for these technologies in the market, some of which are themselves, to Dan's earlier point, entirely new markets, right? For consumer manipulation via chatbots, for example, that could be an entire new market for generating revenue for different types of businesses. Those could be quite productive. They could generate quite a lot of additional GDP, but they're massively harmful. They actually make people or cause people to do things that are against their best interests. So those two offsetting costs in all the modelling are what means that what could otherwise be a 3-4 percentage point upside in productivity for Australia over 10 years, the best estimates at the moment are about 0.5 percentage point, because companies rush into things that are just so. And then you get where you do get new markets evolving, they're just a bit crappy and they're very exploitative. And so we've really got to guard against both of these. And I guess one of the key takeaways, besides the expertise and insight that you can get out of workers once you have given them this opportunity to engage with these issues and give them the space, the other one was just that unless we actually start designing systems with and for workers to open up those productive opportunities given their context, given how their sensitivity to how businesses work, how systems work, particularly in a service-driven economy like Australia, where we're not churning out widgets and we're not just putting new machines on the line all the time, that really is going to make a huge difference. And yet I see almost no movement for really thoughtful engagement of that type. I have one case study that we're developing of a company that's doing this well in the energy sector, Pete, that are really being thoughtful, but they're actually more akin to those kind of more professional level organizations with a big innovation budget. So for your smaller firm or firms where workers have traditionally got lower power and less voice, this is a real concern. And I think, as we do in the report, you might want to call for some good incentives for organizations to lean into working with and listening to workers, and possibly wanting to scale this a little bit at an industry level. So no single individual company, particularly on the SME level, has to bear the full cost of engaging every worker in this way, but instead you can kind of get that knowledge effect and that cohort effect across a number of businesses.
Nick, can I ask that example that you mentioned, the energy company that was doing it well? Self-interested question. Why? Like, what are they? What was it that distinguished them? How are they approaching it? And I ask this, by the way, as someone who runs a tech company and is looking at AI, like every CEO is looking at AI constantly and seeing all the potential there. What are they doing that we should learn from?
It's actually super simple. So the way that they approached it was, they said, we've got this really cool in-house safe generative AI play at the moment. And they said, they basically published across the company, tens of thousands of employees. They said, this is kind of what it can do. Like, it can kind of take our secure data stores, it can read them in, it can find patterns, and it can fill out forms, it can generate text, it can do this. And they said, look, if you've got an idea how this can save you time, contact our innovation team and we'll work with you to see if we can get a pilot up. And so one of the groups of that organization came up and said, we've got a particular safety issue which involves weeks and weeks of work every time for compliance. And it's weeks and weeks of work that has to be done really carefully. But the reason it takes so long is because complex forms, complex filling out. If we could do early drafts with Gen AI, if we could then work to validate that, if we could check, we actually might be able to reduce, for some of these bigger projects, we might be able to actually free up these experts to doing what they need to be doing, which is on-site safety or on-site checking, not the weeks and weeks of compliance front-ending, which at the end of the day is just assembling lots of disparate bits of information, confirming it's in the right spot on a document. You would think we would have solved that with templates years ago, but it turns out we haven't. It turns out we haven't because a human is needed to make sense of all the different fields, all the different aspects, and those forms change quite often. So actually then bringing that as an example, and this company has 5 or 6 other pilots going, what they're doing is they're just basically saying to these groups of people, we're here to help save you time, and we want to save you time, and that's the strategic goal. We're not here to find a solution in the market that our CEO or Chief Technology Officer looks great and then tell you that that's the new way of doing your job. And I really worry that, obviously organizations with innovation budgets and innovation teams have the chance to do that approach. But most organizations, as all of us know, you get an email one day saying, we're turning off this and we're turning on that. Watch this training video and good luck. And that's not how to do your job better.
And Lizzie, one of the things we picked up was almost when the workers talk about it, an analogy to workplace safety. Firstly, that AI was being stuck in the IT department and there was a guy, it wasn't in the organization. And the idea of having an AI officer on the floor that would be helping people if there was a system coming in, working with them to make use of it. But the other thing was almost this idea there should be, and the nurses, I think, were saying, it is like an OH&S issue. There should be a positive duty of care on employers who bring this in to do it well and do it with its workers. And so that idea of some sort of, rather than, which was kind of that lead in about regulating wrongs rather than building general duties from the ground up, which I know we're trying to build on privacy, but if you also did parallel with that with introduction of new technology, then you're starting to build something structural, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think this research is really interesting and I'm excited that you guys have been doing it, in part because I think it was Ed who put this stat in my head. It's been floating around for a little while from Human Technology Institute about how 80% of AI projects or more in enterprise settings fail. And, you know, it's a bit of a loose kind of stat, but I think the general phenomenon sort of checks out as a general idea. That, you know, you buy something potentially off the shelf, you impose it on people in your business, and then it turns out it doesn't work. And to me, what seemed very obvious is that you're missing a feedback source in not talking with workers who implement this. And there's often this assumption that there are unskilled jobs in the economy, people who work in retail or people who don't need a qualification in order to do their job. But increasingly, we're asking these people to work on a daily basis with very sophisticated technology. If you're in retail, if you're in a supermarket now, if you work in a call center, these are quite sophisticated pieces of technology you work with, let alone, you know, nurses who are obviously, it's a skilled profession working with, again, very sophisticated technology. And they're an incredible resource for understanding how that technology works, doesn't work, the kinds of workarounds that people are forced to do that are.
But they also really know where the red lines lie. The workers were so smart, weren't they? The nurses knew exactly where the automation should stop at the point of the human.
Well, that's the other thing I wonder about, because the unions have been traditionally kind of posed as this authority for protecting jobs and the like, but I actually think unions have a really important role to play. You know, I work at a unionised law firm where one of the key, I think, roles that the union plays is offers feedback back to management about how management systems aren't working. And it doesn't have to be super hostile. It's like a consultative process that goes on. It comes to the fore in an EBA process, for example, but does have an ongoing legacy issue where you've got these channels for feedback that aren't you having to pipe up to your manager that this system doesn't work when it might be quite expensive, but in fact a formal mechanism for raising these disputes. I mean, do you think unions have this isn't a Dorothy Dixer, but can unions be the vehicle through which these kinds of discussions are facilitated, or are there better formats for it?
No, 100%, Lizzie. I think we just also have to kind of realize that the reality in Australia is that some areas of work like hospitality have union rates of around 2%, something like that, and so absolutely, I think unions have a huge role to play. I hope that this week at the ACTU Congress, this gets a lot of play and that others are really speaking about just this idea and how we can embed it. And I do, when in all the discussions that I have with unions, that they are leaning right into this idea, not of the kind of, like virtuous Luddite idea of protecting livelihoods, but actually into we're totally on board with making people work better and have higher value for their work. What I see unions and workers in general asking for is not to be kept in a constant state of stress because of the productivity upside of automation. And the thing that I think, Pete, that I was most worried about coming out of the nurses' discussions was a little bit by inference, but their point around wanting to maintain nurse-to-patient ratios was a very explicit nod to the fact that they worried that if the top part of their day that's pretty crappy admin starts to be solved by different forms of AI, they'll just lose people on the ward. They won't have more time to deal with patients. They won't be able to increase the quality of care to Australians. They will actually be taken out, and their jobs will stay as stressful as before.
But that's where the ratios are a really important industrial guardrail,
and that's where I think the union role for negotiating in that industrial guardrail is absolutely essential. I just worry then, well, how do we do that in hospitality? How do we do that? How do we do that in some of the sectors where we actually just have, obviously quite low union rates, and that's a bigger issue for another burning platforms discussion, perhaps.
Around we just need to unionise HealthEngine, because that's your best way, Dan, of getting a really good AI system in.
Thanks for the tip, Peter. We'll take that under advisement. But well, look, in all seriousness, like we have been looking at this pretty extensively over the last couple of weeks as an executive team, and the plan is actually is exactly this. It is to try and bring as many people into the fold, because there are so many avenues where this technology could be used to increase productivity that I don't think just the management team are going to necessarily know about. We literally had a conversation along these lines just this morning in our executive meeting. So I think I'm genuinely viewing this as a productivity gain rather than as a cost cutting thing, because you never have enough people as it is anyway. And that's the potential of this technology, is that the output of your organisation is going to be able to increase exponentially with the same number of people. And I guess maybe I'm being naively optimistic here, but I think this potentially results in more work, or could result in more work for people and not less, because we're able to do that work so much more effectively. I guess that won't be the case, obviously, across the board, but I think I certainly can see that being the case in healthcare in particular, so which is the industry we operate in.
So the retail one of the respondents was, how do you hear about change? And the answer was just rumour. It wasn't even a missive. But the difference between consultation and actually designing from the bottom up, I think is really interesting. Retail is like the classic case study in Acemoglu and Johnson's thesis of what bad technology looks like. If you think about the automated checkouts, it's basically automation plus surveillance. And so the work of the retail worker has gone from being somebody that, yes, they process the prices and you paid, but as the workers say, for some of the people in our shops, we were the only human contact they had any day, and that was what gave our job meaning. And now we stand there and people get the shits with us when the machines are not working, and then we've got to ping the people that are shoplifting by accident. And so it's totally changed the nature of their work in order to save money, but customers hate it and workers hate it, and it's just been a bad design. So yeah, there's so much to take out of it. Like public service workers, Nick, Robo-Debt is such a break for them trying anything. They are so gun-shy now.
Yeah, so gun-shy, and yet, like as we talked about in latest ASIC UTS Regulators Forum a couple of weeks ago, it's not the actual algorithm that was the problem in Robo-Debt. Like it was a poorly chosen algorithm, but the algorithm itself worked. It was the whole system around it, the governance, the listening to advice, listening to public servants, listening to lawyers, and actually, doing the right thing by Australians in the end. That was the problem with Robo-Debt. And yet the impact inside the public service has been, don't trust the machines. Don't trust the machines. And that's quite an interesting, because it's the wrong lesson entirely from all of this. It's about a match between the machine, the task, and the purpose that you're trying to do, right? Like the actual format of the task, why you're trying to achieve that, and what kind of systems. It's all about, as we do talk about in the Human Technology Institute kind of site, it's all about that human-centric approach of really understanding what you're trying to achieve and where humans are in that chain, how to make it better off for people. That starts with listening and hopefully even co-designing. But it's a big shift. It's a big shift from kind of last century worth of Taylorism and management theory, which is tried to treat humans more as machines and turn humans more into kind of human resources rather than actual people. And so I think this is a bit of a wake-up call to say, if we want to do AI right and we want to get all those benefits, we're going to have to do something different, and hopefully we can if we put our mind to it.
on that note, I know it's late in the evening. Hey guys, thanks for indulging us with our research, Lizzie and Dan. But as you can see, we're quite excited about the little journey
I am
we've been
too.
on. And look forward to talking to you guys again in a fortnight. Thanks everyone. I'm not even going to do a what's on. I'm off to Adelaide to talk about this for the next 2 days, so that's exciting for me anyway. But we'll catch everyone again in a fortnight.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
Cheers.
That was Burning Platforms, brought to you by Per Capita's Centre of the Public Square. It was recorded on June 4 and produced on Naarm land by Rebecca Connell.